Apple is also scaling back business in China on the manufacturing side. Reports say it's shifting iPad production out of China to Vietnam. Initial volumes are expected to be small, but the move reveals the vulnerabilities in China's tech supply chain. More than 90% of Apple products are made in China. Lockdowns across Chinese cities intended to cut off the spread of the Chinese Communist Party or CCP virus, the infection that causes COVID-19. But weeks-long factory shutdowns hit supply chains hard. Other Western tech companies have also recently cut services in or retreated from China. Microsoft's LinkedIn, Yahoo, and Airbnb are a few of them. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is criticizing China's genocide and repression of Uyghurs and suppressions on religions. He gave remarks on the issue amid the launch of the 2021 Report on International Religious Freedom, held by the Department of State on Thursday.
PRC continues to harass adherents of other religions that it deems out of line with Chinese Communist Party doctrine, including by destroying Buddhist, Christian, Islamic, and Taoist houses of worship, and by erecting barriers to employment and housing for Christians, Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, and Falun Gong practitioners.
The PRC is China's official name, the People's Republic of China. Beijing initially denied the existence of any detention camps in Xinjiang, but in 2018, officials said they had set up so-called vocational training centers, necessary to curb what it described as terrorism and separatism in the region. Under Beijing suppression, Chinese Christians who belong to China's underground churches often face harassment and arrest. Underground churches refer to those that operate without approval from the Chinese Communist Party. U.S.-based media outlet Radio Free Asia reported that in the last 5 months, in one city alone, at least 10 pastors were detained by police. As for another group Blinken mentioned in his comments, Falun Gong is a Chinese spiritual practice based on the principles of truth, compassion, and tolerance. Before Beijing started to persecute Falun Gong in 1999, numbers of the people practicing the meditation system outnumbered Chinese Communist Party members. The party perceived the practice's widespread popularity as a threat to its communist rule, even though the practice is not involved in politics. Even after 20 years, the mention of Falun Gong in public is still taboo in China. In March and April, more than 400 practitioners of the Falun Gong meditation practice were detained for their beliefs. On March 21st, a 66-year-old female Falun Gong practitioner named Ji Yuanzhi passed away after being tortured for a month and a half at a detention center. It happened in Inner Mongolia. Her son is an architect living in the U.S. And in Tibet, efforts to wash away culture and traditions have been happening for decades. Months ago, authorities in a Tibetan residential area of western China's Sichuan province demolished a 99-foot-high Buddha statue. The reason? They said it was too high. Authorities also forced Tibetan monks to watch the statue being destroyed as a way to humiliate them. The world's spotlight is on the war in Ukraine, and Russian cyber attacks are making headlines. But the FBI warns that the globe's biggest hacking threat actually comes from China. Here's more.
China is the world's largest malicious cyber actor. That's what FBI Director Christopher Wray said last week during a cybersecurity talk at Boston College. He says China pursues long-term goals and operates at a scale to which Russia doesn't even come close to.
They've got a bigger hacking program than all other major nations combined. They've stolen more American personal and corporate data than all nations combined. And they've shown no sign of tempering their ambition and their aggression.
Ray says that China's huge economy gives it tools and leverage that other countries lack, citing an example from 2020. U.S. companies operating in China were required by law to use their certain tax software.
But a number of U.S. companies then discovered that malware was delivered into their networks through that software,
which gave the Chinese Communist Party access to the company's data.
So what that adds up to is that by complying with Chinese laws for conducting lawful business in China, they ended up with backdoors into their systems.
He added that in 2021, Microsoft and other cybersecurity companies disclosed that Chinese hackers had compromised over 10,000 U.S. networks.
And that's just one example of how the Chinese government is pursuing their goal to lie cheat, and steal their way into global domination of technology sectors.
Ray said that China is hiring hackers as if they were cyber mercenaries and providing them with state resources to attack the United States. Ray said in January that the FBI opens a new China counterintelligence investigation about every 12 hours, that there are currently more than 2,000 of those investigations, and that all 56 US-based FBI field offices are engaged in the effort.
Now we turn to our viewers' request for a review of China's influence in Sri Lanka. This can be seen as a textbook example of how the CCP influences many countries around the world. Sri Lanka is enduring its worst financial crisis since its independence. And some are accusing big lender China of using a debt trap to increase its own geopolitical power. NTD's Chenny Wu spoke with an expert to get his take.
Sri Lanka's 22 million people are in a dire situation.
We are presently undergoing a severe economic crisis that has profoundly impacted the lives of all Sri Lankans.
Sri Lanka ran out of foreign currency in April, leading to food shortages, power outages, and protests. And earlier this month, the country defaulted on its debt for the first time in its history. Sri Lanka now owes more than $50 billion to foreign creditors. Among them, China ranks number 3, accounting for around 10% of the debt. But according to China affairs analyst Tang Jingyuan, the Chinese regime has the greatest potential to take advantage of the situation.
It's through this kind of exchange. You owe me some debt. Then you have to hand over control of your important strategic assets.
Tong gave the example of the Hambantota port. Sri Lanka paid for its construction project with $1.1 billion in Chinese loans. It's part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, but the port failed to generate revenue. So when Sri Lanka couldn't pay back its loan, it had to hand over the port and 15,000 acres of land around it to China on a 99-year lease. But why is this significant on the global stage?
It's the geographical location of Sri Lanka. Many consider it to be a prime port of communication throughout South and Southeast Asia, including the Middle East and East Africa, and it's very important in the Indian Ocean. We know that if the Chinese Communist Party gains control of this port, it can build a base there, which could then directly exert political influence on Sri Lanka, and in many cases, even on neighboring countries.
Chinese officials say that Belt and Road projects are business ventures, not aid. Most lending is on commercial terms, and the details are often kept secret. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has said that Beijing is ready to play a positive role in easing Sri Lanka's debt burden. But according to Sri Lanka's Prime Minister, China didn't offer debt reductions, only more loans.
Behind the port strategy of the Belt and Road Initiative is the Chinese Communist Party's geopolitical ambition to expand overseas. That's its fundamental motivation.
Sri Lanka is now holding talks with the International Monetary Fund in hopes of financial relief.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is addressing the Chinese Communist regime's threat. He's calling it the most serious long-term challenge facing the United States and the rules-based world order.
We can't rely on Beijing to change its own trajectory. What we can do, and what we're working to do, is to shape the strategic environment around Beijing to advance our positive vision for an open, inclusive international system. I believe China wants a world order, which is good because order is usually better than the alternative. But the profound difference is this. The order that we've sought to build, very imperfectly, but that we sought to build is profoundly liberal in nature. The order that China seeks is illiberal. We disagree. And it's as basic and fundamental as that.
Blinken says he hopes Beijing sees how the world has come together to support Ukraine and put extraordinary pressure on Russia. Blinken made the comments while speaking to the Council on Foreign Relations. He noted it's important for the Chinese regime to take the right lessons from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He also said the Biden administration wants to lead the international bloc that's opposed to Russia's invasion of Ukraine into a broader coalition. That's to counter what it sees as a more serious, long-term threat to the global order from Beijing. Chinese jets have endangered a Canadian military plane operating in Asia. That's what Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly said Thursday. The day before, the Canadian Armed Forces announced that the air crews in several Chinese aircraft were very clearly visible as they approached Canada's patrol plane, in what Canada called an attempt to divert its own air patrol flight path. The armed forces went on to say the Canadian aircrew had to quickly modify its own flight path in order to avoid a collision. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called China's behavior extremely troubling. He said that the Canadian government would raise this issue with Chinese officials. Canada says similar incidents have happened several times while the Canadian aircraft was deployed to Asia. That deployment was part of the effort to support the United Nations in sanctions on North Korea. The Canadian flights were tasked with observing any attempts from North Korea to avoid sanctions, like the transfer of banned commodities from ship to ship. Similar moves from the Chinese side have been reported several times in recent years. In 2017, Chinese flights confronted a U.S. aircraft, getting as close as 150 feet. In 2019, Chinese fighters flew over a Canadian warship, getting within just 1,000 feet. Latin America has traditionally been considered America's backyard, but the U.S. is losing ground there, while China has been advancing through trade and investment. The U.S. remains Latin America's top trading partner. But if Mexico gets excluded from the picture, then China will have already replaced the U.S. as the top partner to the rest of the region. That's according to a Reuters analysis of UN trade data. Excluding Mexico, two-way trade between China and Latin America hit nearly $250 billion last year. In comparison, the region's trade volume with the U.S. stands at just under $175 billion. America is able to keep its top Latin America trading partner status because of Mexico. The two signed a free trade deal in the 90s, and trade volume between the two overshadows Washington's commerce with the rest of Latin America. Last year, Mexico's trade flows with America stood at over $600 billion. Mexico's trade with China reached around $110 billion. In the meantime, China has been promoting its major investment project in Latin America, the Belt and Road Initiative, though critics call it Beijing's debt trap diplomacy. Under it, the regime offers billions of dollars in loans to developing countries, earmarked for building up their infrastructure. But when countries fail to pay back the money, the regime then takes control of their strategic assets, like ports that could prove useful for military purposes. Over 20 Latin America and Caribbean nations have signed up for China's Belt and Road Initiative. The Biden administration has sent aides to Latin America in an attempt to convince them that the U.S. is a more reliable and transparent business partner. But a U.S. official told Reuters that Washington is facing a tough challenge there. The official said as long as China is ready to put its cash on the table, the U.S. seems to be fighting a losing battle. The official spoke on the condition of anonymity. The Summit of the Americas is currently underway in Los Angeles. The city is home to the largest Latino community in the U.S. President Biden is expected to introduce a new economic agenda for the region while he's there, though administration officials say it will not include new trade agreements. The new agenda aims to mobilize investments, create clean energy jobs, and strengthen supply chains. Any new trade deals could face domestic pushback. Biden promised American voters before that he would not sign any new deals until he's made major investments at home. A new survey shows a strong leaning toward cutting ties with China versus Taiwan. The survey is called the Democracy Perception Index and is the world's largest annual study on democracy. It's co-conducted by the Alliance of Democracies Foundation and German pollster Latana. The survey lasted for over a month and had over 50,000 respondents from more than 50 countries worldwide. When asked about cutting economic ties with China if Beijing was to invade Taiwan, the majority of respondents from 26 countries said yes. Those countries include many of China's top trading partners, like the U.S., Japan, South Korea, and Germany. And they account for over half of China's total trade. That said, over 80% of Chinese respondents agreed with the statement that China is a democratic country. Experts believe this may be related to the respondents' reluctance to speak out against the government.